So Money.com just named Atlanta as the best place to live in the US. I've lived in Atlanta for the last 14 years, so in this video, we're gonna go through the article. I'm gonna tell you what I think is true, what I think you should ignore, and if Atlanta is really a great place to live or not. Coming up right now. So if you've ever had an article written about your city or the place that you live in, you probably had the experience of going through it. You know, maybe they touch on some key points that are correct, and then a lot of it is just clearly written by someone who has not spent a lot of time in that city. Now, last week or a couple weeks ago, Atlanta was actually named by Money.com as the best place to live in all of the US. Now, I live in Atlanta, my business is here. I think this is fantastic. Obviously, I love this city, but going through this article, there were some really interesting things that were pointed out, and even just simple ways that people refer to what it's like to live in Atlanta that are really wrong. And so I thought it would be good to go through this article, point out what they got correct, what they got completely wrong, and give you a better idea of really what it's like to live in the Atlanta, Georgia area. So right off the bat, we should acknowledge these lists are completely arbitrary. In fact, I just looked up US News's ranks of the top cities to live in the US, and Atlanta wasn't even in the top 40. So whenever you're talking about lists, especially with something as vast as cities in the United States of America, don't get too caught up in rankings. If you see a city that's not on this list, it doesn't mean it's not a good city. And if you see a city that's in the top 10, it doesn't mean it's a great city to live in. So these lists are completely arbitrary. They're someone's opinion. So see it for what it is before you get too caught up in that. Now, this article is in Money.com, and I'm going to scroll through it, and we're going to tackle each point to let you know what is true and what's not true, and what is it really like to live in Atlanta, Georgia. Hey, real quick, if this is your first time here, my name is Mark. I live in Atlanta. I'm a real estate agent here, so if you're looking to buy a home in the area or sell a home, whatever it is, give me a call. You can book an appointment using the link in the description below. We would love to connect with you. So the main thrust of the article in Money.com is really that Atlanta is a place where anyone can feel like they can belong. And I don't really argue with that. I just recently did a video about diversity in Atlanta, and although I think it is far from being a true melting pot like New York, we are diverse. We're not the most diverse. We do have a lot of different cultures here. We are a progressive city. So for the most part, I do agree that it is a place where anyone, if not most everyone, can feel like they belong. Now, one of the first things to note in this article is that it points out Atlanta isn't a massive city. Population-wise, it hovers right below 500,000. Now, right off the bat, this is something that really grinds my gears. When people talk about the population of Atlanta, people really don't even know what Atlanta is. Even had that silly, stupid song recently, Not Atlanta. I don't even know who the rapper was, but it caused quite a stir locally in the discussion about what is Atlanta and what's not Atlanta. So listen, whenever you're talking about population, there are statistics that people use for statistical purposes, and then there are practical applications of the real life experience. So to say that Atlanta only has 500,000 people in it, although it's true statistically for the city of Atlanta, when you live here, we really don't just refer to being in the city or outside the city of Atlanta. We use the perimeter created by Interstate 285. It creates a loop around downtown Atlanta. And for practical purposes, you either live inside the perimeter or outside the perimeter. So if we pull up the map, you can see the perimeter around the city, and we have City of Atlanta highlighted. You can see that it only makes up a portion of inside the perimeter, and this is the area where the population is going to be about $500,000. But the article would have you believe Atlanta is similar to Kansas City or Omaha in terms of the population, and statistically that may be true, but I don't want you to get confused that Atlanta feels like a small city. So for practical purposes, I don't have the exact data, but if you add up the populations for the other cities inside the perimeter that are not Atlanta, such as East Point, College Park, you've got North Druid Hills, you've got Brookhaven and Vinings, you're gonna get around 1 million people, give or take, inside the perimeter. And to me, that tracks with the city of New York has about 8 million people, and in terms of just feel-wise, New York being 7 times larger than Atlanta in terms of practical population very much feels right to me. The other thing that people get really confused with this topic is the metro population. Everyone likes to refer to Metro Atlanta. Well, Metro Atlanta is absolutely massive. I have a map up here, and it includes dozens of counties that are nowhere near the city of Atlanta. In fact, the majority of people who live in Metro Atlanta do not live in the city of Atlanta. So a lot of times people refer to the population of Atlanta using the metro population, which is closer to 8 million, but that's not a practical statistic at all if you're living here. You can't be comparing the city of Atlanta to all the way out to Jasper. This is nowhere near the city. This is very rural areas. So right off the bat, I wanted to touch on this because people can't even really seem to get a good handle on how many people are in Atlanta, how dense it feels, how crowded it feels. So just know that although technically the city of Atlanta does have around 500,000 people, there are way more in the space that the people who live here would refer to as the city. Now the article continues in the next paragraph. It says Atlanta is the 4th largest black majority city in the US and the proud hometown of Martin Luther King Jr. And I just want to point out this is one of the biggest things that Atlanta has going for it. Now obviously I am not a black person, so I am going to keep my opinions limited in this arena, but I have to imagine if you are a black person and you're looking for a place to live, a place to move to, start a career, move your family to, Atlanta has got to be high up on the list. Living in this city, now I've lived in many other cities. I've lived in many other states. For whatever reason in my life, I grew up all up and down the east coast of the states. I've lived in Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, Baltimore, Maryland, now Atlanta. I can tell you no other city that I've spent significant time in do you see black people thriving at all levels of the community, entrepreneurs, successful business people, artists, celebrities, and just normal working class people. And I would have to imagine that is a good feeling as a black person to live here, to see people like you succeeding in all levels of the society and the city that you're in. And of course, the civil rights culture is a huge part of the culture in the city of Atlanta. The history of Atlanta is the history of the civil rights movement, and it goes way beyond just the Martin Luther King Museum where you can visit the house that he grew up in. I mean, I can tell you selling real estate in Atlanta, so many of the homes, especially closer to downtown, especially on the west side, they have an incredible history connected to the civil rights movement. So I do think that should be pointed out as a major plus for a lot of people in considering Atlanta. And then it goes on to say Atlanta has some of the best universities in the country, including Georgia Tech. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. And then it says it has America's largest puppetry museum and America's only trap music museum. Now, both those things are technically true, but this is just an example of what I meant earlier, where you read articles about the place that you live in, and it's just clearly written by someone who has not spent a lot of time here. If I'm pointing out all the great, amazing things to do in Atlanta, to spend time doing, I don't think the puppetry museum, no disrespect, would be on that list. It also mentions that Atlanta has professional baseball, but if you go by the reference earlier in the article of the city of Atlanta does not have baseball. The perimeter of Atlanta has baseball, but baseball is now in Cobb County. So yes, we do have a baseball team, but again, I'm just pointing out the details that someone else might not catch. Now, the article goes on to show that Atlanta's labor market is exceptionally strong, and this is something you've heard me talk about all the time on this channel, and it's true. Atlanta's unemployment rate is lower than the national average, and this goes on to say that tech jobs are driving much of that growth. This is one of the main points I want to talk about in this video, the tech jobs and why they're here. But this touches on a very accurate point that you hear me talk about all the time, which is Atlanta has a diverse economy. In other words, we are not built on one industry like coal or shipping, where if that industry takes a dive, the city goes into a recession. We're extremely diverse. We've got shipping, medical, we've got tech, we've got TV and film, we've got education and banking, and so many other types of industry. We also have about 17 companies headquartered here that are in the Fortune 500 and 22 plus companies headquartered here that are in the Fortune 1000. So this is definitely part of the article you should pay attention to. If you're looking to advance your career or start your career, Atlanta should be on your list. We have a lot of great opportunity for a diverse amount of industries in this city. Now, the article touches on an interesting point next. It says Atlanta is not perfect. Rising prices have had an outsized impact on the city's most vulnerable residents and have made it increasingly hard for legacy Black families to afford to live comfortably. Now, this is definitely true, and it's an issue that is increasing in this area, especially over the last few years. I can tell you as a real estate agent, seeing prices rise in the city, you are seeing poor people, and in most instances, poor Black people, be forced outside of the city. Whether they can't afford the property taxes anymore, or they get an offer from a developer that they can't refuse, or they're just a person who wants to live in the city, but they can't afford to. And this is a really big issue, and I don't think it's going to be good for anyone if it's not addressed really soon. And to the last two mayors' credit, they are some significant initiatives, affordable housing in the city, but this is going to be an ongoing problem that I don't think has one simple answer. We are, as a city, are going to have to get more dense, and we are going to have a lot of affordable housing that protects against the rapid growth that is going to continue to happen here. Otherwise, it's going to get crazy. It's going to get like Seattle or Silicon Valley, especially if the public schools get any better. And that's when you have that incredible disparity like you do in a San Francisco, where you have extremely rich people and the homeless living on every street, and no one wants that. So we do need initiatives to protect poor people, to protect Black people from being displaced in the city. So I'm really glad that they mentioned that. Now, the article goes on about a personal story about a person who is living and thriving as an entrepreneur in the city, which I think is great. And then it mentioned that Atlanta has cooperatively owned food manufacturers, buildings, and bike shops. It has a 7-acre food forest. There are 21 farmers markets in Atlanta proper, the vast majority of which accept food stamps as payment. Now, this is all true, but I do think it gives the impression of Atlanta as an extremely progressive city where people are not struggling for food, and that's definitely not true. In fact, there are quite a few areas in Atlanta, particularly West and South Atlanta, that are still designated as food deserts, meaning, grocery stores, your bare essentials are not close enough to people to where it's easy for them to access it, and this can be a real problem. Obviously, for poor people, transportation can be an issue. It can be a big challenge, and you need to be able to get food easily and close by. That's not always the case in Atlanta, and so it does kind of look at this issue with rose-tinted glasses, so I just wanted to point that out real quick. Next, the article goes back into touching on the culture in Atlanta, and I have a few thoughts here. It says Atlanta isn't all that different from other places that made our list this year. It's got ample green space like Denver and Salt Lake City, and that's true. We have all the green space you could possibly want. It's one of the best parts of living here. Historical relevance like Milton, Mass, and Alexandria, VA. A food and music scene with global influences like Rogers Park, Chicago, or Columbia, Maryland. Music scene for sure. Food scene, that's being very generous. I don't think we should be mentioned in the same breath as Chicago for our food scene, just being honest. And an ever-expanding network of bike and walking trails. This is what I'm talking about. That is technically true. Atlanta is also a horrible city for bikers. Okay, you have to be a brave person to ride your bike in Atlanta, and you hear stories all the time of people getting killed or maimed on their bikes. We're just now seeing bike lanes get more and more common in the most trafficked areas. So listen, technically true. We do have an ever-expanding network of biking walking trails, particularly walking trails with the Beltline, but don't get the impression this is a great city for bicyclists. And then it goes to talk about how much there is to do in Atlanta, and I can't argue with this. There is a ton to do, but to me, that's really the deal in any major city, right? There's going to be almost an endless amount of things to do for a city of this size or larger. So it mentions things like Battle and Brew. I haven't experienced that before personally. Talking about 4 professional sports teams. There's no hockey team in there, just so you know. They're including Atlanta United, which is a soccer team, because we lost our hockey team. Talks about the Symphony, which is fantastic. And they quote someone in this article, we have the perfect perfect blend of culture. It just bleeds through Atlanta. Personally, I'm a little critical of the culture in Atlanta. There is culture. I would describe it as like the civil rights movement, music, of course, rap music, trap music, all the, we have deep roots in all different kinds of music. And entrepreneurship, I think we're definitely a city rooted in entrepreneurship to the degree where it does infiltrate all culture, but also it's very corporate in Atlanta. There are a lot of corporate brands that have businesses in Atlanta. Half the restaurants you see did not start in Atlanta. They're chains from the Carolinas or another state. And as we grow, there is a bit of a blandness to how Atlanta is growing. And if you just compared it to a place like New Orleans, when you go to New Orleans, I mean, the culture seeps through every step that you take, every breath that you take in that city. It just eats, sleeps, and breathes, jazz and seafood, and there's history, and I don't know, the culture is just more ingrained in the city experience. It's more palpable. Maybe that's just, my own perspective. It is my own perspective. So, of course, Atlanta has culture, but also there's something very bland and corporate about the way that it's grown over the last 10 years. Now, this article does mention that tech jobs are driving much of that growth. You see companies come in like Microsoft, Google, Facebook. They all have second headquarters or some kind of presence in Atlanta now. But why? No one ever talks about why is that the case? Why are these tech companies setting up shop in Atlanta? Well, this brings me to an article recently I read in CNBC entitled "Atlanta is a growing hub for top tech companies like Apple and Microsoft to find black talent." And here's a quote from Visa's diversity chief, Michelle Geathers-Clark, where she says, "We know that our customer base at all levels includes the black community, and we are not shy about wanting the black community in our workforce." So really, that's the heart of what's going on. These big tech companies want to, hopefully for the right reasons, have more diverse top tech talent. And that's where Atlanta comes in. Yes, we have Georgia Tech, but think of all the amazing historically black colleges and universities we have. Spelman, Clark Atlanta, Morehouse, it goes on and on and on. And that's on top of Georgia Tech and Georgia State, which is a great university as well. It's not just that we have good universities here, it's that we have probably the best, largest pool of diverse tech talent for these companies. So, whether they have the right motivation and wanting to do that or not, it doesn't really matter. But what matters is we have this incredible pool of top tech talent, and this is one of the major drivers of our economy here and the growth of Atlanta. I think that's really cool, and I think it's something that Atlanta should really take note of, and of course they have, and continue to invest in. And honestly, I think the only thing that has held the floodgates back from Atlanta becoming another Silicon Valley of the South or a Seattle or a San Francisco is that our public schools still aren't quite good and the crime has not really gotten under control. There's a lot of gun violence here. So those aren't good things, but also I don't think it would be a good thing if, the floodgates opened and overnight you needed to be a millionaire to live in the city. So it's not that it's a good thing we don't have good public schools, but it's just very interesting to think about these things, realize why it's all occurring. So we have a lot of tech companies moving here because they want to hire diverse talent. We have a lot of great diverse talent. So is Atlanta the best place to live in the US? Well, it could be. Personally, I don't think it's the best city in the country. I have a few others that I like better. Now, I've been here for about 14 years. Obviously, I like it. In fact, it's really grown on me every year that I've been here. I will say I probably would prefer to live in a city where you at least need a permit to own a gun. Little sick and tired of all the unnecessary gun violence that goes on in the city. But it is a beautiful place to live. We have incredible nature, incredible green spaces, incredible things to do outside in nature, rivers, mountains, hiking trails, parks, canopies, botanical gardens. It's truly an amazing place to live if you like the great outdoors. And yes, we have all the typical things that you'd want to enjoy living in the city, all the sports teams, all the fancy restaurants and bars, and funky little weird things to do if you have some niche hobby. We have a very mild climate, we have no natural disasters, we have a very diverse economy, we still have a pretty relatively low cost of living, and there is a lot of room to grow and expand. So there is definitely a lot to love about living in Atlanta, Georgia. Whether or not it's the best place to live in the US, I'll leave up to you. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.